In a quiet corner of Yorkshire, nestled among rolling hills and fields of green, stood a modest farmhouse belonging to George Gilbertson and his family. The house was ordinary enough. Sturdy stone walls, a well-worn hearth, and the bustling sounds of farm life filling its halls. But what made this house different, what set it apart from the dozens of others in the area, was the presence of a mischievous and often malevolent spirit known as a Boggart. No one could say exactly when the Boggart had come to live in the house. Some said it had been there long before George's grandfather had laid the first stones of the foundation. Others claimed it had followed the family home from the nearby woods one autumn evening. Whatever its origins, the Boggart was now firmly entrenched in the Gilbertson household, and its antics were impossible to ignore. It began with small nuisances. The children, a lively bunch with a penchant for mischief themselves, were the first to notice. Bread and butter would disappear from their plates as if spirited away by invisible hands. Young Thomas, the youngest of the brood, had more than once cried out when his bowl of bread and milk tipped over without any warning. The Boggart, though unseen, made its presence known through these petty torments, and the children took to eating their meals with an air of nervous anticipation, ready to clutch their food tightly at the first sign of trouble. But the mischief didn't stop at the dinner table. Nights became a time of strange occurrences for the Gilbertson children. As they lay in their beds, curtains would be drawn back and forth by unseen hands, casting eerie shadows across their rooms. Despite the Boggart's tricks, life continued at the farmhouse. George Gilbertson was a practical man, and his wife, Mally, was a woman of strong resolve. They believed they could endure the spirit's pranks, but the Boggart seemed to thrive on their attempts to ignore it, and its mischief only escalated. One particularly troubling area of the house was the small closet by the kitchen stairs. It was a simple affair, formed by a wooden partition, but it had one peculiar feature: a hole where a large knot had fallen out of one of the deal boards. The children avoided this hole, claiming it gave them an eerie feeling. One day, however, young Thomas, ever curious and playful, decided to stick a wooden spoon into the hole. No sooner had he done so than the spoon flew back out with a loud crack, narrowly missing him. Thomas yelped in surprise and leapt back. His siblings, hearing the commotion, came running. When Thomas explained what had happened, their fear turned to excitement. This was no ordinary haunting. The Boggart could interact with them in unexpected ways. Emboldened by this discovery, the children began to turn the Boggart's antics into a game. They called it "laking with Boggart" and took turns sticking objects into the hole, only to have them ejected moments later. Each time it happened, they shrieked with laughter, even as their parents looked on with exasperation. "Stop provoking it," Mally scolded one evening after seeing Thomas narrowly avoid another flying spoon. "You're only making it worse." But the children, in their youthful defiance, continued their game in secret. The Boggart, it seemed, was growing bolder. The farm's animals were not spared its mischief. Cows' tails were tied together, chickens were set loose from their coop, and tools disappeared from the barn, only to turn up in the most improbable places. George began to feel the strain. The farm was his livelihood, and the constant disruptions were starting to take their toll. Mally, too, found herself at her wits' end. The sleepless nights and the sheer frustration of living with an invisible tormentor wore on her spirit. Finally, after one particularly chaotic evening, the curtains had been torn down entirely and a sack of flour had been appended in the kitchen. George and Mally reached their breaking point. "This can't go on," George said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We'll never have peace here. It's time to leave." Mally hesitated. This was their home, the place where their children had been born and where they had built their life together. But as she looked around at the flour-covered kitchen, she knew George was right. The Boggart had made the house unlivable. The decision was made. The Gilbertsons would move, leaving the Boggart behind to haunt the empty house. Over the next week, they packed their belongings, loading carts with furniture, clothing, and the tools of their trade. The children were subdued, sensing the gravity of the situation. Even Thomas, usually the first to protest any change, helped pack without complaint. On the day of the move, the family was finishing their preparations when their neighbor, John Marshall, arrived. A stout man with a hearty laugh. John had been a friend of the Gilbertsons for years. He eyed the loaded carts with curiosity. "Well, George," he said, "so you're finally leaving the old house, are you?" George nodded grimly. "Yes, John, my friend. I have no choice. That wretched Boggart torments us so badly we can't get a moment's peace, day or night. It seems to have such spite toward the children that it nearly breaks my wife's heart just thinking about it. So, you see, we're forced to move." As George spoke, a deep, mocking voice echoed from one of the carts. It was unmistakably the Boggarts. "Oh yes, George," it sneered. "We're moving, you see." A stunned silence fell over the group. George's face turned pale as the terrible realization struck him. The Boggart wasn't staying behind. It had hidden itself among their belongings and was coming with them to their new home. "Blast it," George muttered, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and frustration. "If I'd known you were there, I wouldn't have taken a single step." He turned to Mally, his resolve crumbling. "Nay, nay, it's no use, Mally. We may as well turn back again to our house rather than be tormented in another that's not so convenient." And so, with heavy hearts, the Gilbertsons turned their carts around and returned to the farmhouse. The Boggart, it seemed, had won. But as they unpacked their belongings and settled back into their home, a strange sense of relief washed over them. This was their house, their land, and their life. If they had to live with the Boggart, so be it. At least here, they knew what to expect. Over time, the family learned to cope with their mischievous tenant. The children resumed their game of laking with the Boggart, though they were careful to keep their antics in check. George and Mally took comfort in the familiarity of their home, even if it came with its share of nightly disturbances. The Boggart's tricks continued, but they were no longer met with the same fear and frustration. Instead, the Gilbertsons adapted, finding humor in the absurdity of their situation. And though the Boggart never let itself be seen, its presence became a peculiar part of the family's story, passed down through the generations as a testament to their resilience and their ability to find joy even in the face of adversity.